They say that silence comes in two forms. The first is the quiet peace that settles before a storm, and the second is the storm itself. It is the profound stillness of a soul that has borne too much weight, a desolate landscape where forgiveness has withered and justice begins to sharpen its blade. For Ethan Hayes, that storm began on a Tuesday night in October, under the cold, indifferent rain of New York City. The rain fell in relentless sheets, washing over the city that had once promised him everything and had instead taken it all. He stood across the street, a ghost invisible to the celebration unfolding within the warm golden glow of Aurelia, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. Inside, Marcus Vance, his former business partner, was raising a champagne flute, his smile as brilliant and false as the diamonds on his wrist. And beside him, laughing, was Amelia, her face illuminated by the candlelight, the woman Ethan had once called his best friend, his everything. They were toasting the billion-dollar valuation of Nexus Innovations, his company, his creation, his life's work built on his code, his sleepless nights, his very soul. But as he watched, Ethan felt no surge of rage, no fiery pulse of hatred. There was only a hollow, cavernous cold. An emptiness so complete it felt like a physical presence inside his chest, a black hole consuming all light and warmth. The rain plastered his thin jacket to his skin, but he didn't feel the chill. A single, warm tear traced a path down his cheek, indistinguishable from the cold drops of rain that washed it away. And in that moment, under the neon glare and the ceaseless downpour, Ethan Hayes ceased to exist. He was a name on a list of failed entrepreneurs, a ghost story whispered in boardrooms. The man who remained was something else entirely, a vessel for a singular, chilling purpose. His plan, which began to form in the cold, quiet void where his heart used to be, was not about reclaiming his fortune. Money was a tool, nothing more. He wanted them to feel this utter desolation. He would not just tear down the empire they had built upon his ruins. He would become the architect of their despair, ensuring they would live out their days in a prison of their own making, haunted by the ghost of the man they had so carelessly destroyed. Before the storm, there was a season of sunlight, a time so golden in memory that its warmth could almost feel like a lie. To understand the wreckage, you must first walk through the halls of the palace that was, to see the bonds that were forged before they were so brutally broken. The story of Ethan, Amelia, and Marcus did not begin in a boardroom filled with spreadsheets and projections, but in the quiet, unassuming suburbs of New Jersey, in a world of scraped knees, shared secrets, and lemonade stands. Ethan Hayes and Amelia Carter grew up next door to each other, their bedroom windows facing one another, silent witnesses to a friendship that was as natural as breathing. He was the quiet observer, the boy who would rather take apart a radio than play baseball, his mind a universe of circuits and logic. She was his translator, his bridge to the rest of the world, a vibrant soul who understood his long silences and could articulate the complex thoughts he struggled to voice. Ethan saw the world in lines of code and elegant algorithms, a series of puzzles waiting to be solved. Amelia saw the world in colors, emotions, and the intricate, often messy connections between people. She was the only person who could coax him out of his shell, the only one who saw the brilliant, gentle heart behind his shy exterior. There was a love between them, a deep and abiding love that hovered in the space between heartbeats, in the long pauses of their late-night conversations from their adjoining windowsills. It was a love built on 2 decades of shared history, of knowing each other's fears and dreams without ever needing to ask. But it was a language Ethan, for all his genius, never learned how to speak. He assumed time was on his side, that their connection was so fundamental it needed no formal declaration. He was wrong. And then came Marcus Vance. He didn't just enter their lives, he erupted into them. Marcus was a force of nature, a whirlwind of charisma, ambition, and effortless confidence. He transferred to their college in junior year, the son of a wealthy real estate mogul, yet he possessed a hunger to carve out his own legacy. He moved with the easy grace of a man who had never been told no, his words weaving tapestries of future glory that made people want to believe, to follow. He saw Amelia at a campus event and was instantly captivated, pursuing her with a focused determination that was both dazzling and relentless. He offered her a world of certainty, of grand gestures and spoken promises, a world that Ethan's quiet, unspoken affection could not compete with. When Amelia, with a touch of guilt in her eyes, told Ethan she and Marcus were together, Ethan did what he always did. He buried his own heart for her happiness. He swallowed the words that were screaming to be let out, smiled, and promised to be there for them both. And he was. He became the steady, reliable foundation upon which their relationship was built. He helped Marcus with his calculus homework and listened to Amelia's worries about her future. They became an inseparable trio, a perfect triangle of ambition, intellect, and heart. It was during their last year of college that the seed of Nexus Innovations was planted. It came to Ethan not as a plan for a company, but as a solution to a puzzle that had consumed him for months. An artificial intelligence so advanced it could learn, adapt, and predict human needs with startling accuracy, an elegant, almost sentient digital consciousness. He was vibrating with excitement, the idea too big to contain. The first person he told was Amelia. He laid it all out for her, not in technical terms, but in the language of wonder she understood, describing a future where his creation could help people in countless ways. Her eyes lit up, not just with understanding, but with profound belief in him. It was she who insisted he tell Marcus. That night, in their small off-campus apartment, Ethan explained his vision. Marcus, unlike Amelia, didn't see the poetry. He saw the empire. He saw the patents, the market disruption, the path to billions. His eyes had the predatory gleam of a wolf who had just spotted his prey. "You are the architect, Ethan," Marcus had said, his hand clapping Ethan's shoulder with a proprietary weight. "You are the Thomas Edison of our generation. But an inventor needs a showman. You create the world, and I will sell it to them. Together, we can build something that lasts forever." The partnership was formed on a handshake and a shared bottle of cheap whiskey. Ethan would be the chief technology officer, the silent genius behind the curtain. Marcus would be the CEO, the charismatic face of the revolution. Their first office was a cramped space above a laundromat, smelling perpetually of bleach and ambition. The days were a blur of caffeine and code, the nights filled with arguments, breakthroughs, and the kind of exhilaration that only comes from creating something from nothing. Ethan would code for 36 hours straight, fueled by little more than inspiration, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he brought his vision to life. Marcus was a whirlwind of motion, taking meetings, charming investors, and selling a dream that, at the time, existed only on Ethan's monitor. And Amelia was their anchor. She wasn't an employee, not officially, but she was the soul of the company. She brought them coffee and food at 3 a.m. She mediated their creative disputes. She was the first to read every business plan, the first to celebrate every small victory. When they secured their first round of funding, it was Amelia who popped the champagne, her joyful tears reflecting the blinking server lights. She was the glue that held the two disparate halves of Nexus Innovations together. As the company grew, their lives transformed. The laundromat was replaced by a sleek office in Soho with glass walls and skyline views. The cheap takeout became catered lunches. Ethan was still the quiet genius, but now he led a team of the brightest minds in the country. Marcus, now married to Amelia, became a celebrated figure in the tech world, a visionary lauded on the covers of magazines. They were living the dream they had sketched out on napkins just a few years before. Ethan, watching Amelia and Marcus together at company parties, felt a familiar, dull ache in his chest, but he pushed it down. He had his work, and he had their friendship. He believed, with a loyalty that bordered on naivety, that this was enough. But that is the cruelty of memory. It paints the past in hues of gold, making us forget that even in the brightest sunlight, long shadows are being cast. And the shadow that was growing over Nexus Innovations, cast by the blinding glare of greed and ambition, was darker and more patient than any of them could have possibly imagined. The golden age of Nexus Innovations was destined to end, as all such ages do. Every great empire has a moment when it is most vulnerable, not in its infancy nor in its decline, but at the very peak of its power, on the cusp of even greater glory. For Nexus, that moment arrived in the form of a merger offer from Omnicorp, a global tech conglomerate. The deal was valued in the billions, a figure that would not just make them wealthy, but would make them legends. It was their coronation, the final validation of their dream. For Ethan, it was the culmination of his life's work. For Marcus, it was the perfect opportunity to commit the perfect crime. The betrayal did not begin with a shout, but with a whisper in the digital dark. For months, as the Omnicorp negotiations progressed, Marcus worked in the shadows with the meticulous patience of a spider weaving its web. He saw the company's intricate financial systems not as a testament to their success, but as a canvas for his masterpiece of deception. Using his unrestricted CEO-level access, he began to move money, not in large, obvious sums, but in 1,000 tiny, untraceable streams. He created a labyrinth of shell corporations in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, each one a digital dead end. He then created a ghost in the system, a counterfeit user profile with security clearances that mirrored Ethan's, designed to mimic his unique digital footprint. Through this phantom identity, he initiated the transfers, building a fraudulent empire in the dark while smiling and shaking hands in the light. But stealing the money was only half the plan. The true artistry of his betrayal lay in the construction of the narrative. Marcus began to poison the well, drop by drop. In hushed conversations with board members, he would express concern for Ethan. He'd sigh, mentioning how Ethan was becoming difficult, how the immense pressure of the merger was making him erratic and secretive. He masterfully twisted Ethan's very nature into a weapon. Ethan's famous introversion, his need for long, uninterrupted hours to code, was reframed as obsessive detachment. His natural desire for privacy became evidence of a hidden agenda. The cruelest cut, however, was how Marcus weaponized their friendship. Every vulnerability Ethan had ever shared in confidence, every late-night conversation about the burdens of success, was now curated and twisted into a motive. Ethan's frustration with a particularly demanding investor was spun into a story of a deep-seated vendetta. His idle daydreams of one day selling his shares and traveling the world were presented as a meticulously laid plan to take the money and run. Marcus was not just framing his friend. He was assassinating his character with the intimate knowledge only a brother could possess. The day of the execution was a Thursday. The air in the office was electric with the impending Omnicorp announcement. Ethan walked into the main boardroom, expecting a final review of the technical integration. Instead, he was met with a wall of cold, accusatory stares. The company's board of directors, their legal team, and a pair of stone-faced forensic accountants were all seated around the polished mahogany table. At the head of it all sat Marcus, his expression a mask of profound, heartbreaking sorrow. "Ethan," Marcus began, his voice thick with feigned emotion, "we have a problem." What followed was a blur of corporate jargon and calculated lies. The accountants presented their findings, a cascade of charts, encrypted ledgers, and international wire transfers that painted a damning picture of massive embezzlement. And at the center of the web, they explained, was a digital trail leading directly, unequivocally, to Ethan Hayes. Falsified emails sent from his account, transaction logs bearing his digital signature. The ghost profile Marcus had created was presented as Ethan's own secret tool. The accusations were so monstrous, so fundamentally impossible, that for a moment, Ethan could only stare in stunned silence. He looked at Marcus, searching for some sign, some tell that this was a grotesque joke. But he found only the steady, pitying gaze of a practiced liar. His denials were weak, stammering. How do you defend yourself against a lie so complete, so perfectly constructed? Every protest was met with another piece of fabricated evidence, another sorrowful shake of Marcus's head. It was a show trial, and the verdict had been decided months ago. He was unanimously voted out of the company he had created, his shares frozen, and his termination effective immediately. Dazed and disoriented, he stumbled out of the boardroom. He needed to find Amelia. She would know. She would see the truth. She had known him his entire life. She would never believe this lie. He found her in the glass, walled atrium overlooking the city, the very spot where they had celebrated their first major investment. When she turned to face him, her eyes were not filled with the righteous anger or confusion he expected. They were filled with a chilling, soul-crushing disappointment. Marcus had already performed his final, most venomous act. He had reached her first, feeding her a carefully crafted story of how he had discovered Ethan's theft, how he had confronted him, begged him to stop, offered to help him return the money quietly. He had painted himself as the hero, trying to save his fallen friend from his own demons. "Marcus told me everything, Ethan," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet each word was a hammer blow. "He told me how he tried to help you, how he offered you a way out. How could you do this? To him? To the company? To us?" He tried to speak, to tear down the wall of lies that stood between them, but he could see it was useless. The trust was already gone. It was not the loss of his company, the theft of his fortune, or the ruin of his reputation that finally broke him. It was the look in her eyes, the death of a lifetime of belief. In that moment, he understood. Marcus hadn't just stolen his future, he had poisoned his past. 2 security guards appeared, their presence a final, blunt humiliation. They escorted him to the elevator, a silent, surreal journey down from the heavens he had helped build. As he walked out of the gleaming lobby and into the afternoon sun, his phone buzzed, a news alert. The headline read, "Tech visionary Ethan Hayes fired from Nexus Innovations amidst massive fraud scandal." The execution was complete. The serpent's kiss had delivered its poison, and the venom was now coursing through every vein of his life, leaving nothing but absolute ruin in its wake. The fall was not a single, violent impact. It was a long, grinding descent into a darkness he had never known existed, a slow-motion demolition of a life. In the weeks and months that followed his ousting, Ethan Hayes learned the true meaning of isolation. His name, once synonymous with innovation, was now a curse, a shorthand for greed and failure. Friends he had known for decades, men and women with whom he had shared dreams and celebrated victories, now crossed the street to avoid his gaze. His phone, an object that had once buzzed incessantly with the rhythm of his life, fell silent, its stillness a constant, mocking reminder of his exile. He was a ghost in his own city, a walking headline that people read with a mixture of pity and contempt. Justice, he quickly learned, is not a right, but a luxury commodity he could no longer afford. He hired a lawyer with the last of his accessible savings, a decent man who was hopelessly outmatched. Marcus had retained one of the most powerful corporate law firms in the country. They buried Ethan's small legal team in an avalanche of motions, injunctions, and delays. Every day was a fresh humiliation. A new bill he couldn't pay, another small piece of hope chipped away. The legal battle was not a search for truth. It was a war of attrition, and Ethan had already lost. To survive, he began to sell his life. First went the Soho loft with its panoramic city views, replaced by a cramped, damp apartment in a forgotten corner of Queens. Then went the car. Then the art, the furniture, the remnants of a life he no longer lived. Each sale was a small death. He sold the watch Amelia had given him for his 30th birthday, the cool weight of it on his wrist, a memory he could no longer bear. He sold the first server that had ever run the Nexus code, a piece of hardware that felt more like a part of his own body. He was not just selling objects, he was selling his memories, piece by painful piece, until all that remained was the hollowed-out shell of a man. His days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of instant noodles, legal letters, and the suffocating weight of 4 walls. The world, he realized, had already forgotten him. The lie Marcus had told was so complete, so widely accepted, that it had become the truth. Ethan Hayes was the villain of the story, a cautionary tale whispered to ambitious young entrepreneurs. He was trapped in a prison without bars, sentenced to a life of quiet desperation, haunted by the smiling faces of those who had put him there. The turning point did not come with a bolt of lightning or a dramatic epiphany. It came on a Tuesday night, in the sterile quiet of a public library, the only place he could still access the internet for free. He was idly scrolling through a society news website when he saw it. A photograph, Marcus and Amelia beaming on the red carpet of a children's hospital charity gala. Marcus looked regal in a tailored tuxedo, his arm wrapped possessively around Amelia's waist. She was breathtaking in a glittering silver gown, her smile as radiant as ever. The caption celebrated their extraordinary generosity and Marcus's visionary leadership. Staring at that image, at their perfect, celebrated, carefree lives built upon his ruin, something inside Ethan shifted. The despair that had been his constant companion for a year did not vanish. Instead, it crystallized. It hardened from a debilitating liquid grief into a solid core of ice in his chest. A profound and terrible clarity washed over him. He finally understood. The system was not broken. It was working perfectly. There would be no appeal, no exoneration, no justice from a world that had already judged and condemned him. To seek justice from them was to beg for scraps from the table of his own executioners. The man in the photograph was not the friend he had loved. He was a predator. And the woman beside him was not the victim he had pitied. She was a willing participant in his victory. In that moment, the fight for his old life died, and the war against their new one began. He no longer wanted to clear his name. A name was meaningless. He no longer wanted his money back. Wealth was a weapon, not a prize. What he wanted was retribution. A biblical, all-consuming retribution that was as meticulous and as devastating as the betrayal itself. They had taken his life. He would, in return, dismantle theirs, brick by stolen brick, lie by twisted lie, until nothing remained but the same hollow emptiness they had left him with. He would become the architect of their ruin. With the last few $100s to his name, he began his final act as Ethan Hayes. In the anonymous hum of the library, his mind, dulled by months of depression, sparked back to life, sharper and more dangerous than ever before. He moved through the digital world like a phantom, a ghost in the machine he himself had helped build. He used backdoors he had coded years ago, exploited security flaws only he knew existed. He purged records, corrupted backups, and planted false trails that led to digital dead ends. Within 72 hours, every official trace of his existence, tax records, social security data, credit history was effectively erased. He was a digital ghost. The final piece of the puzzle was not digital, but brutally physical. He used his last credit card, now a worthless piece of plastic, to rent a car. He drove for 2 days, heading north into the remote wilderness of upstate New York. He bought a junk car for cash from a scrapyard, a rusted, barely functional vehicle. He drove it to a treacherous stretch of road overlooking a deep, fast-moving river known for its unforgiving currents. Under the cover of darkness, he sent the car careening over the edge. A small, untraceable incendiary device he had built from common electronics ignited the gas tank on impact. The resulting explosion was small but violent, ensuring the fire would consume whatever remained. A brief article appeared in a local paper a week later. Body of disgraced tech CEO Ethan Hayes presumed lost in fiery crash. It was a footnote in the news cycle, a pathetic and fitting end to a tragic story. As the flames of his old life lit up the night sky behind him, he did not look back. With a fake passport, a new name in his pocket, and a mind now singularly focused on a cold and patient vengeance, he melted into the darkness. Ethan Hayes was dead, and from the ashes of that fire, a phantom was born. Vengeance is not a fire that burns hot and fast, consuming itself in a blaze of glory. True, lasting vengeance is a glacier. It is a force of nature forged in cold and silence, moving with an imperceptible slowness until it has gathered enough mass and momentum to crush mountains, to reshape the very landscape it passes through. For the phantom, who was once Ethan Hayes, the next 5 years were his ice age, a long, brutal period of silent, relentless formation. He did not spend those years wallowing in hatred. He weaponized it, channeling it into a disciplined, all-consuming program of self-annihilation and rebirth. The first step was to destroy the face of the ghost. In a sterile, discreet clinic in Zurich, the face of Ethan Hayes, with its soft lines and gentle, trusting eyes, was methodically erased under a surgeon's knife. It was a painful, brutal process, but with every layer of gauze that was unwrapped, he felt not a sense of loss, but of liberation. The man who eventually looked back at him from the mirror was a stranger, and that was the point. The face was sharp, angular, the jawline more defined, the nose straightened. But the most significant change was in the eyes. The surgeon had done nothing to them, yet they were different. The warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, piercing gray, the color of a winter sky over a frozen lake. Eyes that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. With the physical ghost exorcised, he began to build his fortress. While the world saw the burgeoning cryptocurrency market as a speculative novelty, Ethan's analytical mind saw the underlying architecture, the pure, unassailable logic of the blockchain. He didn't gamble, he calculated. Working from a series of anonymous laptops in nondescript apartments across Eastern Europe, he built algorithms that could predict market fluctuations with uncanny accuracy. He poured his small, carefully guarded seed money into the digital ether and watched it multiply again and again. His fortune grew exponentially, a silent, digital testament to the genius the world had discarded. He diversified, becoming an anonymous angel investor in obscure but brilliant tech startups, companies built on the kind of disruptive ideas he once championed. He became a myth in the digital underworld, a legendary figure known only by a cryptic username, a ghost who could make or break a company with a single, untraceable investment. But a fortune without a history is a liability, so he began the most difficult task of all: the creation of Julian Thorne. The construction of this new identity was as meticulous as any code he had ever written. He consumed knowledge with a ravenous appetite. He studied global finance, art history, classical music, and the complex geopolitics of the super-rich. He learned to speak fluent German and conversational Mandarin. He developed a palate for fine wine and single malt scotch. He hired tutors, not for academics, but for culture, for the subtle codes of old money and new power. He shed the last vestiges of the shy, awkward programmer. He underwent rigorous physical training, not for strength, but for presence. He corrected his posture, changed his gait, and erased the nervous energy that had always defined him. He forged a new voice, lower, more measured, a voice that carried the weight of an unspoken history and immense power. Julian Thorne was not a disguise. He was a new entity, built from the ashes of the old. Before he ever set foot back in New York, the name Julian Thorne was already a whisper in the highest echelons of global finance. He was an enigma, a self-made billionaire, with no discernible past, no family, no history before the last few years. His investments were bold, ruthless, and flawlessly successful. Rumors swirled about him. Some said he was the black sheep of a European royal family, others that he had made his fortune in black market technology. Julian encouraged none of these rumors and denied none either. His silence was his greatest asset, a blank canvas onto which people projected their own fears and desires. When he finally returned to New York, it was not as a ghost haunting his own past, but as a predator returning to his hunting grounds. The city was the same, but it was also entirely different. In the 5 years since Ethan's death, Marcus Vance had ascended from a mere CEO to a titan of the tech industry. He was a media darling, a regular on talk shows and magazine covers, lauded as a visionary, a philanthropist, a self-made king. Nexus Innovations, now a subsidiary of Omnicorp, was more powerful than ever, its technology integrated into every facet of modern life. And Amelia, ever at his side, had blossomed. She was the chairwoman of a dozen charities, her face a staple on the society pages, a celebrated icon of grace, compassion, and effortless style. They lived in a sprawling penthouse on Park Avenue, a glass palace in the sky, their life a perfect, glittering fairy tale, a fairy tale built on a grave. Julian Thorne acquired a minimalist penthouse of his own, a sterile apartment of glass and steel overlooking Central Park. It was not a home, it was an observation deck, a sniper's nest. From there, he watched. He studied them with the cold detachment of a scientist observing a specimen. He read every article, analyzed every interview, mapped out their social circles, their business dealings, their daily routines. He saw Marcus's arrogance, his overconfidence, his insatiable need for public adoration. He saw the subtle, almost invisible cracks in Amelia's perfect facade, a fleeting sadness in her eyes during a charity speech, a forced quality to her smile in candid photographs. He was in no hurry. The forging of the weapon was complete. Now, with the infinite patience of a man who had already lost everything and had an eternity to wait, Julian Thorne prepared to make his first, deliberate, and exquisitely painful cut. The hunt had begun. A predator does not announce his presence with a roar. He becomes part of the landscape, a shadow that moves in the periphery, his approach so gradual, so natural, that the prey does not sense the danger until the jaws are already closing. Julian Thorne understood this better than anyone. His revenge would not be a frontal assault. It would be a quiet, systematic infiltration, a poison introduced into the heart of his enemy's world. His point of entry was not the fortified walls of Marcus Vance's corporate empire, but the softer, more accessible world of his wife. Julian's meticulous research had revealed one thing with absolute certainty. While Marcus's life revolved around power and profit, Amelia's revolved around perception and purpose. Her primary source of this was the Carter Foundation for Underprivileged Youth, a charity she had founded and chaired with a fierce devotion. It was her identity, her shield, and her stage. To attack Marcus directly would be to engage a fortress head-on. To influence Amelia, however, was to find a secret, unguarded door into the castle itself. The first thread of the web was spun with an 8-figure wire transfer. It arrived in the Carter Foundation's account without fanfare, an anonymous donation so large it immediately solved every funding issue they had for the next decade. Its anonymity was its power. It created a mystery, a buzz within the city's philanthropic circles. Amelia was ecstatic, but also intensely curious. Who was this silent, profoundly generous benefactor? She made it her personal mission to find out. After 3 weeks of carefully managed speculation, Julian allowed his name to be discreetly revealed to her through his lawyers. A meeting was arranged. He did not summon her to his sterile, intimidating office. Instead, he suggested a private viewing at a small, avant-garde art gallery in Chelsea, which, he noted, his private equity firm also quietly supported. When Amelia walked in, she found him not in a suit, but in a simple, dark cashmere sweater, studying a chaotic, abstract painting. He was not what she expected. He was not loud or ostentatious like so many of the city's wealthy men. He was calm, almost unnervingly still, and his greeting was polite but reserved. He thanked her for coming and immediately turned the conversation to the foundation. He had read every report, every mission statement. He spoke about her outreach programs with a surprising depth of understanding, asking insightful questions that showed he had done more than just write a check. "You've built something of real substance here, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice low and even, his gaze direct. "It's rare to see such genuine passion in a world so often driven by vanity." The compliment landed with surgical precision. It was not flattery about her beauty or her social standing. It was an acknowledgement of her work, her intellect. It was a validation she secretly craved and rarely received from her husband, who often referred to her foundation as her little hobby. She was disarmed. Over the next hour, they spoke not as donor and recipient, but as peers. He listened, truly listened, with an intensity that made her feel as if she were the only person in the world. He never once mentioned his own business or his wealth, keeping the focus entirely on her and her vision. This first meeting blossomed, as he knew it would, into a professional alliance. His donation was transformative, and as the new primary benefactor, his input was essential. They began to meet weekly, poring over plans for a new educational center his money was funding. It was during one of these meetings, in the quiet corner of a hotel lounge, that Julian made his next move. He began to carefully, subtly, plant the seeds of doubt. He never spoke of Marcus, and he certainly never spoke of Ethan. Instead, he told stories, polished allegories from his past in Europe. He spoke of a former business partner, a man he had once considered a brother. "We built something from nothing, just 2 young men with a single, brilliant idea," Julian recounted, staring into his glass of scotch, his voice tinged with a carefully practiced melancholy. "We were unstoppable. But success has a way of revealing a man's true character." He began to believe the dream, the entire history, was his alone. "The man I knew vanished, replaced by a stranger who saw friendship as nothing more than a line item on a balance sheet." He let the story hang in the air, unfinished, a ghost of a memory. He watched Amelia closely. She shifted in her seat, her smile tightening just enough to be noticeable. She picked at a loose thread on the napkin in her lap. He could see a flicker of an old, buried thought in her eyes. His story, so carefully constructed, was a key turning in a lock she had forgotten existed. It forced her, perhaps for the first time in 5 years, to think of Ethan Hayes. Not the disgraced thief from the headlines, but the quiet, brilliant boy she had grown up with, the other half of another partnership built on a dream. The guilt she had so expertly suppressed for half a decade began to stir, a faint, sickly warmth in the pit of her stomach. As her trust in him grew, she began to confide. It started small. Complaints about Marcus's long hours, his obsessive focus on a new, high-risk venture. Julian never offered advice, never criticized her husband. He simply listened, his gray eyes filled with a deep, empathetic understanding that was entirely feigned. His silence was an invitation, and soon, the small complaints grew into larger revelations. She spoke of Marcus's temper, which had grown shorter over the years. She spoke of his controlling nature, how he had taken over their personal finances completely after her mishap with a charity auction budget. She confided her frustration that he dismissed her opinions, treating her more like a beautiful accessory than a partner. "He's making some new investment," she said one afternoon, her voice laced with a frustration she rarely showed anyone. "Something huge. He won't tell me what island. Whenever I ask, he just says I wouldn't understand. That I should focus on my parties and my dresses." Every word she spoke was a gift. Every frustration she shared was a crack he could later exploit. He was learning the weaknesses of the fortress from the queen herself. The web was now firmly anchored. In a few short months, Julian Thorne had transformed himself from a mysterious name on a wire transfer into Amelia Vance's most trusted confidant. He had gained access to the inner sanctum of their lives, not through force, but through a gentle, calculated sympathy. He now had a perfect, unobstructed view of the hairline fractures forming in the foundation of their perfect kingdom. And he knew, with the chilling certainty of a demolitions expert, exactly where to place the dynamite. In the art of war, the greatest victory is that which requires no direct battle. You do not lay siege to the fortress, you cut off its supply lines. You divert its rivers, you poison its wells. You create an environment of such chaos and scarcity that the king, believing his castle is crumbling from within, will personally throw open the gates to the enemy he mistakes for a savior. Julian Thorne was a master of this silent, suffocating warfare, and the economic siege of Marcus Vance's empire had now begun. The first attack was invisible, a ghost in the global supply chain. Through a series of anonymous shell corporations, Julian acquired a controlling interest in a small, obscure mining operation in Bolivia. This mine was the world's primary source for a uniquely pure gallium arsenide crystal, a component absolutely essential for the next generation of Nexus processors. Almost overnight, the supply became unreliable, and the price tripled. Marcus's operations team scrambled, seeing it only as an unforeseen market fluctuation, a problem to be solved with money. They had no idea it was a targeted strategic strike. The second attack came from the markets themselves. Using the vast computational power of his private investment firm, Julian unleashed high-frequency trading algorithms designed to create subtle but persistent instability in Omnicorp's stock. At the same time, carefully worded, anonymous rumors began to circulate on elite investor forums, whispers of internal strife at the Nexus division, of delays in their product pipeline, of Marcus Vance being distracted. The stock took a 2-point hit, then another. It wasn't a crash, but it was a bleed, a slow erosion of confidence that made the Omnicorp board nervous and put immense pressure on Marcus to deliver a spectacular win. The third and most audacious attack was a direct challenge to his kingdom. A sleek, unknown German startup called Ethereal Logic, secretly funded entirely by Julian, launched a new AI processing unit. It was faster, more energy efficient, and significantly cheaper than Nexus's flagship product. It began to aggressively eat into their European market share, an unthinkable intrusion into Marcus's untouchable territory. Marcus Vance, for the first time in 5 years, felt the unfamiliar and deeply unpleasant sensation of being hunted. He couldn't see the hunter. The problem seemed disconnected, a string of terrible luck. But the walls were closing in. He grew short-tempered, paranoid, working longer and longer hours, his famous charisma fraying at the edges. He needed a win, not just a small one, but a monumental move that would silence the whispers on the board and re-establish his dominance. And in this storm of uncertainty, one name began to surface in financial news and boardroom conversations like a lighthouse: Julian Thorne, the mysterious billionaire whose every move turned to gold, a man who was not afraid of risk and who possessed seemingly infinite capital. In his growing desperation, Marcus did not see Julian Thorne as another problem, but as the ultimate solution. In his hubris, he could not conceive of a predator more dangerous than himself. He saw Julian not as a threat, but as a magnificent, powerful tool waiting to be wielded. He would not just partner with Thorne, he would conquer him, using his capital to crush his own problems and take all the credit. The meeting was set on Julian's terms, in his office. The space was a reflection of the man himself, vast, minimalist, and cold, with a single panoramic window offering a godlike view of the city below. Marcus arrived full of swagger and charm, launching into a grandiose pitch for a joint venture to dominate the Asian markets. Julian listened for 20 minutes without interruption, his face an unreadable mask, his gray eyes missing nothing. He saw the desperation behind the bravado, the sweat on Marcus's brow that was almost, but not quite, invisible. When Marcus finished, Julian was silent for a long moment. "It's a solid plan," he said finally, his voice flat. "But your vision is too small, Mr. Vance. You're thinking about market share. I'm thinking about legacy." He let the subtle insult hang in the air before he leaned forward, laying the true trap. "I am working on something else," Julian continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Something revolutionary. Codename, Project Chimera." He went on to describe an audacious, top-secret venture involving the fusion of quantum computing and adaptive artificial intelligence. The concepts he described were brilliant, complex, and eerily familiar, echoing the visionary language Ethan Hayes used to use in their earliest days. This was deliberate. It was the first, subtle turn of the psychological screw. He proposed a new, independent entity to run Project Chimera, co-funded by both of them, but, crucially, structured to operate outside the direct oversight of the Omnicorp board to avoid bureaucratic drag and intellectual theft. The real genius of the trap was its structure. It offered Marcus exactly what he craved: unimaginable profit, total credit for a world-changing technology, and most importantly, zero oversight. "There is one condition," Julian said, his eyes locking onto Marcus's. "This project requires absolute discretion and agility. I need a partner who is not afraid to bend the rules for the sake of true innovation. I will provide the seed capital, but to secure the second stage funding, you will need to leverage Nexus's assets in creative ways the board might not immediately understand." He was not telling Marcus to commit fraud. He was appealing to his ego, challenging his nerve, and handing him a golden shovel to dig his own grave. Marcus's eyes lit up with a greedy, triumphant fire. He saw it all in a flash: a Nobel Prize, his face on the cover of Time magazine, an empire that would make his current one look like a child's plaything. He would finally, truly eclipse the ghost of Ethan Hayes' genius and become a legend in his own right. He didn't see the bars of the cage, he only saw the glittering bait. "I'm in," Marcus said, a broad smile spreading across his face as he extended his hand. "You won't regret this, Thorne." Julian took his hand, his grip firm and cold. "I know I won't," he replied, his voice devoid of any emotion. As Marcus Vance left the office, beaming with the thrill of his great victory, Julian stood by the window, watching the man's reflection disappear into the streets below. The wells had been poisoned, the supply lines were cut, and the king, desperate and blind, had just personally unlocked the main gate to his own castle. A life built on a lie is like a house with a cracked foundation. From the outside, the walls may be beautiful, the windows may glitter in the sun, and the gardens may be perfectly manicured. But inside, unseen, the cracks are spreading with every passing day, waiting for the slightest tremor to bring the entire structure crashing down. For Amelia Vance, the tremors had begun, and her perfect life was starting to feel terrifyingly unstable. As Marcus plunged deeper into the complexities of Project Chimera, the man Amelia lived with began to change. The first signs were small, easily dismissed. He started taking phone calls in his locked study, his voice a low, urgent murmur. His laptop, once left open on his desk, was now always shut, the screen dark and impenetrable. When she asked about his day, his answers became curt and vague. "It's Chimera," he would say. "The name itself a shield. It's complicated. You wouldn't understand." The easy, confident smile he wore for the public was gone the moment he walked through their penthouse door, replaced by the grim, haunted look of a gambler on a losing streak. He was irritable, snapping at the household staff over trivialities. He barely slept, often pacing the length of their apartment in the dead of night, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He began using the heavy wall safe in his study, a place previously reserved for her jewelry and their passports. Now he would secret away files and ledgers, always glancing over his shoulder to ensure she wasn't watching as he spun the dial. Each secret meeting, each hushed phone call, each locked door was another crack spreading across the polished facade of their marriage. Amelia's vague unease began to curdle into genuine suspicion, and Julian Thorne was there to expertly nurture it. During their now frequent meetings for the foundation, he played the part of the concerned friend to perfection. He would notice the dark circles under her eyes, the way her attention would drift. "Amelia, is everything all right?" he would ask, his voice a perfect blend of gentle concern and respect for her privacy. "You seem a world away. I hope the pressure Marcus is under isn't affecting you too deeply." He never accused. He only ever expressed concern, positioning himself as her ally, her safe harbor in a gathering storm. Then he would plant the seeds of contradiction. He would mention, in passing, seeing Marcus's car outside a downtown hotel when Marcus had claimed to be in a late-night meeting at his office. "I'm sure he had a good reason for the change of venue," Julian would add smoothly, leaving the dissonant fact hanging in the air for her to puzzle over. He made her suspicion feel like her own astute observation, not an idea planted by him. "You have excellent instincts, Amelia," he told her one afternoon. "I've seen it in how you run this foundation. You should always trust them." The breaking point came when Marcus lied about a weekend trip to Chicago for a tech conference. A stray comment from the wife of another executive revealed there was no conference. It was a small, clumsy lie, but it was the one that broke the dam. If he would lie about something so trivial, what monumental truths was he hiding? That night, as Marcus slept a heavy, whiskey-induced sleep, Amelia's fear of what she might find was finally overcome by the terror of living in the dark. The silence of the penthouse was deafening as she slipped out of bed and made her way to his study. The room, once a shared space of comfort and ambition, now felt like enemy territory. The wall safe loomed in the shadows, a silent metal tomb of secrets. She didn't know the combination, but she knew her husband. She knew his vanities. She tried their anniversary. Nothing. His birthday. Nothing. Then she remembered something Ethan had told her once, years ago, laughing. Marcus's ego is his greatest password. She thought for a moment, and then her fingers, trembling slightly, spun the dial to the date Nexus Innovations was officially founded, the date his empire began. A soft, heavy thunk echoed in the silent room. The safe was open. Inside were two sets of documents. The first were recent, related to Project Chimera. They were filled with leveraged assets, suspicious wire transfers to offshore accounts, and agreements that seemed to place all of the risk on Nexus and all of the potential reward with a holding company she didn't recognize. It was financial treason, and it confirmed her worst fears about their present. But it was the second set of documents, tucked away in an old, leather-bound folder at the very back, that truly destroyed her. The folder was labeled EH Contingency. Inside were the original partnership documents for Nexus Innovations, the hopeful, sprawling signature of Ethan Hayes beside Marcus's neat, controlled one. and beneath them was the entire playbook for the betrayal. Printed emails between Marcus and his lawyers from 5 years ago. A handwritten timeline detailing the methodical creation of the false evidence. And, worst of all, a page of notes, in Marcus's own hand, on how to manage the emotional fallout. On the list was a single, chilling line item. Convince A, appeal to loyalty. Frame as saving E from himself. The documents did not shake her world. They liquefied it, melting away 5 years of blissful ignorance in a searing, unbearable instant. The man she loved, the life she had built, the very foundation of her identity as a good person, was a fraud. She was not the wife of a brilliant visionary. She was the wife of a common thief. But the deepest cut was the revelation of her own role. She remembered her pitying disappointment in Ethan. She remembered turning her back on the boy who had been her other half. The shame was a physical force, so powerful it buckled her knees, and she sank to the floor, a silent scream trapped in her throat. She hadn't just been a bystander to the crime. She had been the final, most effective weapon, the one that had delivered the emotional death blow. Her belief in the lie had been the nail in Ethan's coffin. As the first gray light of dawn crept into the silent study, it found Amelia Vance kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the paper wreckage of her life. The tears had stopped. The shock had given way to a cold, hard clarity she had not felt in years. The house was still standing, but the foundation had crumbled into dust. She was no longer a wife. She was a witness. And she knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that the tremors were not over. The earthquake was still to come. Every story of hubris has a final chapter. It is the chapter of the fall, the moment when the man who believed he could fly is reminded, with brutal finality, of the unforgiving nature of the ground. For Marcus Vance, that chapter was about to be written in the exquisite ink of fire and shame, on a day that was supposed to be his greatest coronation. The morning was bright and clear, a perfect, crisp autumn day in New York. In the main conference room of Nexus headquarters, on the 72nd floor, the mood was electric. This was the day Project Chimera, the venture that would redefine the future of technology, would be officially unveiled to a select group of Omnicorp's most powerful board members. Marcus was in his element, a king holding court. He moved through the room with a liquid confidence, his smile broad, his handshake firm, accepting the hushed, reverent congratulations from men who had once been his superiors. He had never felt more powerful, more invincible. At precisely 10 a.m., he stood at the head of the vast marble table and dimmed the lights. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice resonant with triumph, "today we take the first step into a new world." On the massive screen behind him, a secure video link connected, and the face of Julian Thorne materialized. It was a face rendered in flawless high definition, impossibly calm, his gray eyes seeming to look not at Marcus, but through him, at the assembled board. "Thank you for joining us, Julian," Marcus said magnanimously. "As the primary partner in this venture, it's only fitting you be here for this historic moment." Marcus was about to launch into his prepared speech when Julian's voice, amplified by the room's surround sound system, cut through the air like a shard of ice. "Thank you, Marcus. Your contribution to this exercise has been invaluable." The word hung in the air, wrong and dissonant. Exercise? A confused murmur rippled through the room. Marcus's smile faltered. "I'm not sure I understand, Julian." Julian's expression did not change. "Project Chimera," he announced to the stunned room, "does not exist." He proceeded to explain, with the cold, dispassionate tone of a professor delivering a lecture, that the revolutionary technology was nothing more than a series of theoretical white papers he had commissioned. The prototypes were empty shells. The entire venture was a meticulously constructed fiction, a corporate ghost. "Consider it," Julian stated, "a psychological and ethical stress test. A simulation designed to discover what a high-level executive, given immense resources and minimal oversight, would do when presented with an opportunity that seemed too good to be true." Before the board could process this staggering revelation, a second, perfectly timed attack was launched. At that exact moment, As if orchestrated by a phantom conductor, every phone and tablet in the room buzzed in unison. An email had arrived, sent from a heavily encrypted, untraceable source. The subject line was 3 simple words: "The real Marcus Vance." Inside was everything. A digital dossier, flawlessly organized, detailing Marcus's systematic fraud in the name of Project Chimera, the illegal leveraging of Nexus assets, the wire transfers into his personal, undeclared accounts in Panama, scanned copies of the documents Amelia had found in his safe. But it went deeper. The dossier also included a second folder, titled The Original Sin. It contained the complete, unassailable proof of the 5-year-old plot to frame Ethan Hayes. Marcus's own notes, the falsified transaction logs, even audio snippets from conversations with his lawyers. It was a digital atom bomb, a decade of lies and theft laid bare in a single, devastating email. As the blood drained from Marcus's face, Julian delivered the final blow. For the record, his voice echoed through the horrified silence. That same package of information was delivered to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FBI's white-collar crime division, and the New York Times precisely 90 seconds ago. Checkmate. It was not just a move, it was a flood, a deluge of truth from which there was no high ground, no escape. The boardroom erupted into chaos. The spell was broken. The king was naked, and his courtiers were not just abandoning him, they were looking for knives, shouting accusations, their minds racing to calculate how to distance themselves from the epicenter of the blast. As the shouting reached a fever pitch, the heavy doors to the conference room burst open. But it wasn't security. It was 4 FBI agents, their dark suits and grim faces, a stark contrast to the expensive tailoring of the executives. "Marcus Vance?" the lead agent said, his voice cutting through the noise. Marcus stood frozen, a hollowed-out statue of a man. He didn't speak as they approached him. As they informed him, he was under arrest for wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. The cold, metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent room, a sound more final than a gunshot. On the screen, the image of Julian Thorne was gone. He had disconnected the moment before the agents entered, his part in the public execution complete. Miles away, in his sterile penthouse, he watched it all unfold on a bank of silent monitors. He watched the Omnicorp ticker turn blood red, plummeting in freefall as billions in value evaporated. He watched the breaking news alerts flash across every channel. He watched the live helicopter footage of a pale, shackled Marcus Vance being pushed through a frenzied mob of reporters and into the back of an unmarked car. There was no smile on Julian's face, no fist pump of victory. There was only the quiet hum of his machines and the profound, chilling emptiness of a purpose fulfilled. The empire had fallen. The king was in chains. The world saw a stunning, cautionary tale of corporate greed. They believed they were watching the end of the story. But Julian Thorne knew it was merely the end of the second act. The final, most personal judgment had not yet been rendered. In the wreckage of a life, a person clings to any solid object they can find. For Amelia Vance, her life now a smoldering, unrecognizable ruin, the only solid object left in her world was the man who had lit the fire. Julian Thorne. Her name was toxic, her assets frozen, her friends gone. Marcus was a headline, a monster in a cage, awaiting a trial that was a mere formality. Left with nothing but the deafening silence of her empty penthouse and the crushing weight of public shame, Amelia was consumed by a single, desperate need. She needed to understand why. It was this need that led her to make the call, to beg for a meeting with the architect of her despair. He agreed to see her, not in a public place, but at his penthouse, the glass box in the sky. When she arrived, the sterile emptiness of the place was a shock. There were no photographs, no books, no art that seemed personal, no signs of a life lived. It was a monument to emptiness, a perfect reflection of the man who greeted her at the door. He was dressed simply, as he had been when they first met, and he offered her a glass of water, his movements calm and deliberate. Amelia was a ghost of herself, her face pale and drawn, her expensive clothes hanging loosely on her frame. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking, the word a raw, broken thing in the cavernous silence. "I understand what Marcus did was wrong. But why this? Why destroy him, destroy everything, so completely?" Julian didn't answer immediately. He walked to the vast window, his back to her, looking down at the city lights that glittered like a carpet of fallen stars. "I cannot speak to your husband's character," he said, his voice as calm and distant as the stars themselves. "But let me tell you a story about a different man, a programmer. He wasn't much to look at, a bit shy, lived more in his head than in the real world. He had one friend, a girl he'd known his whole life. She was his Sunday, his anchor." Amelia stood frozen, a cold dread beginning to seep into her bones. This was not the answer she had expected. Julian continued, his voice a low, hypnotic monotone. "This programmer, he had an idea. A brilliant, world-changing idea. But he was just the architect. He needed a builder. So he and another man, the man his friend chose to marry, started a company. They called it Nexus." Amelia's breath hitched in her throat. Julian recounted the early days, the office above the laundromat, the taste of cheap pizza at 3 a.m, the thrill of their first major success. He spoke of things that were not in any newspaper, details so intimate, so specific, they could only have come from someone who was there. He mentioned the inside joke about the ghost in the machine, a buggy line of code Ethan had never been able to fix. He recalled the exact pattern on the faded armchair Amelia used to curl up in while the two men worked. With every detail, another layer of Amelia's composure was stripped away. These were not facts. These were her memories, her life. And this stranger was speaking them as if they were his own. He then moved on to the betrayal, his voice never changing its measured, chilling cadence. He described the emergency board meeting, the fabricated evidence, the cold, accusatory stares. And then he turned the knife. "This programmer, he told me that the loss of his company, of his fortune, it was painful, yes. But the cruelest blow, the one that truly killed him, was the look of disappointment in the eyes of his oldest friend, in the atrium overlooking the city. He said it was in that moment he understood what it was to be truly alone." Amelia was shaking now, her mind refusing to make the impossible leap. "How?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "How could you possibly know all of this?" Julian Thorne finally turned from the window to face her. The mask of the cold, enigmatic billionaire was gone. His gray eyes, no longer unreadable, were now filled with the weight of 5 years of pain and cold fury. For the first time, in the sharp line of his jaw, in the profound sadness that haunted his expression, she saw him. She saw the ghost. "The man is gone, Amelia," he said, and his voice was different now, lower, rougher, the voice she heard in her dreams and her nightmares, the voice of Ethan Hayes. "But his memory remains. And he wanted me to ask you something. He wanted me to ask if, in all these years, living in your beautiful home, attending your glittering parties, if you ever, for one single, solitary second, felt a shred of guilt for what you did to him." It was not a realization. It was a collision. The ghost of her past and the architect of her present slammed together with the force of a physical blow. The name escaped her lips as a strangled, broken sound, a prayer to a ghost. Ethan? The carefully constructed walls of her world, already fractured, shattered into dust. The guilt she had buried, the shame she had ignored, the truth she had refused to see, all of it erupted in a tidal wave of agony. She collapsed, her knees hitting the cold marble floor with a dull thud, and she began to sob. It was not a cry of self-pity for her lost life, but a raw, animal wail of profound, soul-deep remorse for the friend she had betrayed, for the boy she had helped to destroy. "I'm sorry," she wept, the words meaningless, pathetic. "Oh God, Ethan, I'm so sorry." He watched her break. He watched her sob on the floor of his empty, soulless palace. And he felt nothing. There was no pity in his eyes, no flicker of the old affection. The part of him that might have felt such things had been carved out and cauterized in a lonely, roach-infested apartment in Queens 5 years ago. His silence was her true punishment. It was the vast, empty silence of a dead man who could no longer hear her apologies. She had come seeking answers from a powerful stranger. Instead, she had found a ghost. And in his terrifying presence, she was forced, at last, to face the truth of her own damnation. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. What they don't tell you is that when the meal is over, the cold remains. It seeps into your bones, a permanent, unshakable chill that no victory can ever truly warm. In the days following the unmasking, Ethan Hayes, the phantom wearing the face of Julian Thorne, set about passing his final judgments, not with fire and fury, but with the quiet, deliberate precision of a god setting his broken world in order. His first destination was a place of gray walls and palpable despair, the Metropolitan Detention Center. The man who sat opposite him, separated by a thick pane of scratched plexiglass, was not Marcus Vance, the titan of industry. He was a ghost of a different sort, a shrunken, hollowed-out shell wearing a drab, prison-issue jumpsuit. The arrogant fire that had once burned in his eyes had been extinguished, leaving behind only the dull, gray ash of utter despair. Marcus looked up, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. He had been told a Mr. Thorne was there to see him, a fact that made no sense in his shattered reality. He stared at the face of the man who had destroyed him, searching for an answer. Why? Marcus's voice was a dry rasp over the crackling intercom. All of it? For what? A business deal? Market share? Ethan picked up the receiver. He no longer needed the cold, clipped accent of Julian Thorne, nor did he return to the softer tones of the boy he once was. His voice was something new, something forged in the crucible of his 5-year exile. It was flat, empty, and devoid of all emotion. "Do you remember the office above the laundromat, Marcus?" he asked. The question, so out of place, so specific, visibly stunned his former friend. Marcus's eyes widened, the first flicker of true understanding dawning in their depths. "Do you remember the taste of the coffee Amelia would bring us at 3 a.m? Do you remember the name we almost called the company before we settled on Nexus?" He didn't need to say his own name. He saw the recognition crash over Marcus like a physical blow. The blood drained from Marcus's face, replaced by a ghastly, pale shock. This was not an enemy. This was a ghost he himself had created. "Ethan," the name was a choked, disbelieving whisper. "It can't be." Ethan leaned forward, his gray eyes pinning Marcus in place. "I didn't come here for an apology, Marcus. I didn't come here to gloat. I came here so you would know. I wanted you to understand, as you sit in this cage for the next 20 years, that your ruin was not a matter of bad luck. It was not a market downturn. It was a matter of design. It was a promise made on a rainy night 5 years ago. A promise that has now been kept." He placed the receiver back on its cradle, severing the connection. He did not feel the elation he had fantasized about for years. He felt nothing but a quiet, grim finality, like closing a book on a long and tragic story. He stood up and walked away without looking back, leaving Marcus Vance to be haunted, not by the specter of Julian Thorne, but by the ghost of the friend he had murdered. His judgment for Amelia was different. It was not delivered in person, but through a team of impassive lawyers. They presented her with a single, thick envelope. Inside was not a lawsuit or a threat, but the articles of incorporation for a blind trust. It had been established anonymously, funded with a sum of money so large it would allow her to disappear and live a life of quiet, unobtrusive comfort anywhere in the world she chose. It was not an act of forgiveness. It was an act of severance, a final, clean cut of the ties that bound them to a shared past. The offer came with an implicit choice. She could take the money, change her name, and vanish into obscurity, or she could remain Amelia Vance, the disgraced wife of a notorious felon, and face the public trials and endless humiliation that awaited her. He was offering her a choice of prisons, one of quiet, comfortable anonymity, or one of shame and public scrutiny. He did it not for the woman she had become, but as a final act of charity for the boy he once was, the boy who had loved the girl next door. It was a way of erasing the final piece of his old life, of letting the ghost of that boy finally rest. And then, it was over. The war was won. The enemies were vanquished. The intricate, all-consuming plan that had been his life's sole focus for 5 years was complete. Julian Thorne, the weapon he had so meticulously forged, was no longer needed. He stood alone in the vast, silent penthouse. The news cycle had already moved on. The world had forgotten Marcus Vance. And in the profound silence that followed his victory, Ethan discovered a terrifying truth. The war, the hatred, the singular focus of his vengeance had been the only thing keeping him alive. He walked to the mirror and stared at the face of the stranger looking back. The face of Julian Thorne. He had won. He had achieved a justice so perfect, so complete, it was almost poetic. But as he stood in the empty monument to his victory, looking out over a city that no longer knew his true name, he felt a profound and aching loss. He had avenged Ethan Hayes, but he had not resurrected him. He had simply built him the most magnificent tomb in the world. The fire of his revenge had burned his enemies to ash, but it had also consumed him, leaving a hollowed-out man in its wake. The final judgment had been passed, not just on Marcus and Amelia, but on himself. He had become the architect of ruin, and now he was the sole, lonely resident of the wasteland he had created. He had his justice. Now he had to learn how to live with it, or if living was even possible, in the long, cold, and silent winter that was to follow. 3 months passed. The seasons turned, and the city, with its short memory, began to forget the spectacular implosion of Marcus Vance. The news reported that he was sentenced to 25 years in a federal prison, a quiet, procedural end to a loud and violent scandal. Of Amelia, there was only silence. She had vanished. Her lawyers informed Ethan that she had refused the trust fund he had established. She had left a single, sealed envelope for him. Inside, a short, handwritten note on plain paper. It read, "There is no starting over from this. My punishment is not one you can give me. It is the one I must live with every day." And then, she was gone, a ghost who had chosen her own exile. With the last loose ends tied, Ethan stood in the sterile penthouse that had been his command center and knew that he too had to disappear. The man known as Julian Thorne was a weapon, and the war was over. A weapon has no purpose in peacetime. He had to leave, to walk away from the fortune, the power, and the stranger in the mirror, to discover if there was anything left of Ethan Hayes, or if both men had truly died in the fire of his revenge. It was in a dusty box of relics from his former life, salvaged by his first lawyer and ignored for years, that he found it, a small, simple USB drive. He vaguely remembered its story. Amelia had given it to the lawyer a week after his dismissal, saying it was the last of his personal files from the office computer. In his grief and rage back then, he had thrown it in the box, a painful, mundane reminder of a world he had been violently ejected from. He had never once plugged it in. Now, with a strange sense of finality, he decided to wipe it clean before he left. He slid the drive into his laptop. It was mostly what he expected: old code fragments, drafts of project proposals, a few scattered photos. He was about to format the drive when he saw it. A single folder, named with a random string of characters, a simple trick to hide it in plain sight. His curiosity, an emotion he had not felt in years, was piqued. Inside was one file, an audio file. It was named simply, "Listen." He put on his headphones and clicked play. The sound of a room, a faint echo, then voices. Marcus's voice, sharp and irritated, and Amelia's, trembling with a desperate urgency he had never heard from her before. "Marcus, please," her recorded voice pleaded. "We can't do this. You can't do this to him. It's his entire life. It's everything he island." There was a pause, the sound of a heavy sigh from Marcus. "It's our life now, Amelia. His or ours. Don't be a fool. The deal with Omnicorp is on the line. Everything we've talked about." Amelia's voice grew stronger, laced with a defiance that twisted something in Ethan's chest. "I don't care about the deal. I care about him. He's our friend. I'll tell him. I'll warn him. I swear to God, Marcus, I will not let you ruin him." Then, Marcus's voice changed. The irritation was gone, replaced by a cold reptilian venom that made the hairs on Ethan's arms stand up. "You will do nothing," Marcus hissed. "You will smile, and you will stand by my side. If you say one word to him, I will not only destroy him, I will destroy your family. I will call in the loans I co-signed for your father's business. He'll be bankrupt in a month. I will make sure the story about your brother's college indiscretion finds its way to his new firm. You will be silent. Do you understand me?" The recording ended with a single, muffled sob from Amelia, and then a long, terrible silence. The audio file finished, but the silence it left behind was the loudest sound Ethan had ever heard. It was a roar that tore down the very foundations of his victory, his perfect revenge, his flawless, calculated justice. The entire moral architecture of his last 5 years was built on a lie. Not Marcus's lie, but his own. It was built on an incomplete, arrogant, and blind truth. He had seen a simple story of a villain and an accomplice, when the reality was a far more tragic tale of a monster and his hostage. He had punished a conspirator, and he had punished a captive. He had taken a woman who was also a victim, a woman who had tried to save him and was silenced by fear, and in his cold, precise quest for justice, he had shattered her life as completely as Marcus had once shattered his. The hollow ache of a battle won was now replaced by the sharp, searing, and unbearable pain of a soul truly lost. His victory was not just empty, it was a tragic, unforgivable mistake. In the relentless pursuit of justice for a betrayal, we sometimes become the very thing we are fighting against, creating new, deeper wounds in the process of avenging the old. And the truth, we often learn too late, is not always a clean and shining sword. Sometimes, it is a shard of glass that cuts the hand that wields it, revealing a reality far more painful than the lie it was meant to destroy. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much, for you never know if their silence is one of complicity or if it is the last, desperate shield of a heart protecting someone else from a pain you cannot possibly comprehend. Ethan Hayes, or the man who was left, erased the file. He packed a single bag, leaving the ghost of Julian Thorne and his vast, sterile fortune behind in the empty palace in the sky. He walked out into the world, not as a victor, but as a penitent, forever haunted by the two tragedies of his story, the friend who had betrayed him and the friend he had failed. Thank you for listening. Join us next time, where the secrets we keep are often more dangerous than the lies we tell. Until then,